Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Global Counselling Psychology Forum webinar series. This is the second of the webinars that we are putting on for applied psychologists and mostly counseling psychologists. For today, we're going to be talking about the state of the profession, counseling psychology, as well as any developments. And within that, we've just completed a position paper for Global Counselling Psychology. We would like to tell you a little bit about that and have an official launch with everyone here. There's some sound in the background. Can I ask people to put themselves on mute for the duration of the discussions, and then everyone can pitch in when they can. Thank you. So the agenda or the plan is to have the launch of the position paper. Then we'll go into the local presentations from colleagues from around the world. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, and then there's a Q&A at the end. I'm trying to keep to time, but I'm also trying to keep an eye on other things. So please do bear with me. Maybe I say a little bit about the Global Counselling Psychology Forum. The Global Counselling Psychology Forum was established 3 years ago following the UK Division of Counselling Psychology Conference, where we had the chairs and presidents of counseling psychology around the world discussing counseling psychology as a whole. And from that, we discovered the commonalities between counseling psychology and some of the challenges that the profession was facing. And so at the time, with colleagues, we agreed to form a forum where the chairs and presidents of counseling psychology around the world can come together and discuss issues that we are facing as a profession. And as such, one of the things that we talked about was the philosophy of counseling psychology and the development of counseling psychology in the different parts of the world. And we have the position paper. I wondered whether one of the group members can please put in the chat the link for everyone here who may not have access to it. I will be sharing my screen just to talk through what the position paper looks like. And if I find the link, I can do that.
I can do that, Yetunde. I'll post that in a second.
Thank you. So the position paper, I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me. I'm really rubbish at technology, so bear with me. I hope I haven't shut it down. Okay. Bear with me a second.
Okay, so that's been posted in the chat for those that want to be able to access it.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so I've got so many things open on this one. There we go. Right, can people see my screen? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So this is what you guys will have access to once you're able to go onto the link that Michael shared with us a moment ago. It's the position paper, and essentially what it does is it goes through the rationale for the position paper in terms of having global visibility for counseling psychology. It talks about the history of counseling psychology, in the different parts of the world. So you would read the development of it in Australia, in Ireland, in India, in New Zealand, in Singapore, South Africa, UK, and the US at the moment. It goes through the philosophy and the competencies and the value, and how the profession can remain sustainable, not just to the professionals practicing within it, but also to the people that we serve. And it essentially highlights all of those things that I've just indicated, the premise of counseling psychology philosophy. And then it focuses on who we are as counseling psychologists, because I don't know about any of you attending. Some applied psychologists, wherever you go in the world, it's taken for granted the provision and the premise of what that applied psychology is. So we thought that in developing this position paper, it might help other colleagues in other countries that have not yet established counseling psychology as a profession within that locality, to be able to present a profession that supports the mental health and the well-being of the community. So that's just the premise of the position paper that we've written. One thing to add is that we're hoping that this is a working document, and as time evolves, we will be ensuring that we are updating the position paper, making it as current as we possibly can. I wondered whether any of my other colleagues who contributed to the paper would like to say anything before we officially hallelujah this position paper. No? Anyone? Okay. I can't see my screen completely of everyone, so if you are wanting to say something and I can't see you, please put on unmute yourself and speak, please. Okay, I will take that as a no, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and let's begin. Okay, so now we're to the position of having the local presentation, and our first colleague would be Michael, who is here representing Australia. Michael, I'll let you introduce yourself and please start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yetunde. Welcome, everyone. I'm speaking from Melbourne here in Australia, where it's a very ungodly hour of 10 past 5 o'clock in the morning. So bear with me if I'm not as sharp as I would usually be at a more reasonable hour. I'm obviously a counselling psychologist based here in Australia. I've been involved with our sort of Australian Psychological Society College of Counselling Psychologists for about 20 years now. I was national chair for about 6-year period, and I currently sit on the committee as involved as the international representative as well as also strategy as well. So I've got a very hard task of trying to talk to you about the state of counselling psychology in 5 minutes. So I'll just give a very brief overview around what the features of the profession in Australia are, and then talk a little bit about what are some of the current challenges and some of the current things that we're focused on. So for those of you that don't know much about counselling psychology in this part of the world, we first emerged here in Australia in the early 1970s, and we're actually one of 9 areas of applied psychology that's recognised by our regulatory body here. So counselling psychology is the second largest field, and we have about 1,000 counselling psychologists across Australia. What's been some of the more challenging parts here is that we only have one training program at the moment. So we only have the one postgraduate training program for counselling psychologists, and that's got a relatively small intake of about 12 students per year. That's gone down from about, we had about seven training programs in the early 2000s, and really what we've seen over the last 20 years or so has been a reduction in training programs in counselling psychology, but that's also been across the board for all areas of applied psychology aside from clinical psychology. That's seen quite a lot of growth over the last 20 years, and all other areas, including counselling psychology, has seen reductions. In terms of how the profession looks here, in terms of the profile of counselling psychologists, from some of the recent surveys that we've done, we have probably about 60 to 70% of counselling psychologists that work in private practice as a primary job, and then about another 40 or 50% that do private practice as a secondary job. So it's very much a profession here in Australia of people who operate in private practice. And really some of the features of our competencies are really the provision of counselling and psychotherapy, expertise in a broad range of evidence-based therapies. And really one of the features here in Australia that's also led to challenges around professional identity is that counselling psychologists here are really skilled around working across the continuum from those that might present with mild to moderate concerns right through to complex, chronic and enduring mental health difficulties. And that, I think, whilst that's a key feature of counselling psychology, it's also created tensions around professional identity, around how we separate ourselves from other fields of applied psychology here in Australia as well. And some of the research that we've done in recent years has really indicated that counselling psychologists here really have a strong connection to the philosophy and values of the profession. And some of the surveys that we've done in recent years has really indicated that people here in Australia have made the choice to become a counselling psychologist because they feel aligned with those values and competencies around what it represents to them. As I sort of indicated, we've had quite a lot of period of challenges here in Australia. As I said before, we've only got the one training program that's got a very small intake at the moment of about 12 students a year. We also have a population that is probably at the later stages of their career as well. As some of the surveys have found that most of our members sort of average age tends to be in the late 50s, early 60s. So, you know, that's creating challenges for how the field's going to look in the future if we only have a very small number of practitioners coming through each year, and we have a largely aging sort of population of people that are towards the latter stages of their career. We've also got huge challenges here around funding schemes. A lot of the both public and private funding schemes tend to reimburse clients of clinical psychologists much higher fees as opposed to clients of other psychologists, including counselling psychologists. So that creates lots of issues around tensions for the field, obviously within counselling psychology, but much broader as well. And that's been part of the shift as to why many people have actually chosen to train in clinical psychology as opposed to the other 8 areas of applied practice. And one of the things that's been a really key feature also, or some of the challenges, has been tensions with scopes of practice. So about in 2010 here, we had an introduction of national registration for psychology. And essentially what happened at that time were the competencies for counselling psychologists got watered down quite significant at that time. So there was a real reduction around acknowledgement of the work that we do in working with mental health problems and complex mental health difficulties. And that's created huge issues around professional development, professional identity as well. One of the things that we're trying to do as a college, and I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just get this relatively quickly, is that we are trying to really get a sense of how many people are interested in training as a counselling psychologist. As I said, we only have the one training program, and last year the college did a large survey of all fourth-year graduates in Australia asking about their intentions and interests to study counselling psychology. And we actually found that about 70% of people indicated that if a counselling psychology program was available, they would actually train in counselling psychology. So we're engaged in some advocacy at the moment with universities and higher education providers, taking to them this data and really trying to advocate for the reopening of training programs. I will leave it at that because I think I'm getting the wind up of my 5 minutes is up. So I'll pause there at that time.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Ashutosh, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Yetunde. And I don't know what to say, good night or good morning or anyways, I'm Ashutosh and I'm representing Bharatiya Counselling Psychology Association from India as president. And in India, counseling psychology is not a very old specialization. If we look at the history, in late 90s, counseling psychology as a branch of study started picking up. And then since then, we were not a regulated branch of study. However, most of the psychologists are employed as counselors or counseling psychologists for that matter, but there was no regulator. Only specialization of psychology which was regulated by government or a regulator was clinical psychology. And we were continuously advocating for the to the government that we get some regulator. In 2018, we got one National Commission for Allied Healthcare Professionals, which covers the registration of all psychologists, including counseling psychologists as well. So in 2017, we are also not a very old organization. In 2017, we formed the Association of Counseling Psychologists, and since then we started our advocacy. And before that, there was a lot of identity crisis. Because we were not regulated, a lot of people, especially clinical psychology people, used to call counseling psychologists as quacks, as people who are not qualified, not trained. But then we started the identity assertion as counseling psychologist in 2017. And now there is a huge number of psychologists who are identifying themselves as counseling psychologists. So those who have masters, minimum masters with specialization in counseling, they call themselves counseling psychologists in India. Some of them have taken advanced training as PhDs or maybe diplomas or therapeutic certifications to build their capacities and capabilities to function as counseling psychologists. So in India, we are still in a very struggling phase. Because there is no regulator, so there is no legal protection, there is no insurance, there is no administrative structure or no funding concept related to this. However, there are some government universities, public universities, which are running counseling psychology programs, especially diplomas and masters. So that ways we can say there are some courses which are supported by the government, but still it's a long way to go in India. And the rest of the things, we are on the same page. The counseling psychology branch is struggling around the globe for various issues, though the issues are different, but yes.
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Thank you.
Tim, would you like to go next?
Hello, Tim here from Dublin, Ireland. Good evening on my end, but maybe good morning for other people here. So I have a few points dotted down based on the others that are speaking and some things that I thought were interesting sharing. So the psychology body in Ireland, chairperson of the division, our division here is, last time I checked, I believe it's either the second or third largest division in the Psychology Society in Ireland. So counselling psychology is pretty big, together with clinical and educational. We currently have 250 members registered with the division. That doesn't mean that there's not more, right? There might be more people not registered with the division itself. There's a history that is briefly described in the position paper for those who are interested, how counselling psychology in Ireland in 1989 went from a one-year master to a couple of years later to a two-year master's, and in 2012 roughly it transformed into a three-year doctorate. So I personally completed the doctorate in Ireland in counselling psychology. That does, I suppose, really mean that the vibe in Ireland very much includes lots of people with masters in counselling psychology and a whole, almost last 8, 9, 10 years stream of folk with doctorates, right? So there's a real interesting mix going on. There is, similar to in Australia, really, there was at some point, there were two masters running, I believe one in Cork, one in Dublin, around training for counselling psychology. There currently is only one, which is the doctorate that I mentioned. It's the only program in Ireland. It takes 3 years. It takes about 12 to 14 people a year. So similarly enough, it's a small intake of students that then end up qualifying. Counselling psychologists that graduate do end up working in private practice or in the public sector. and are accepted in the public sector are very much welcomed into it as well. There is only since September last year, there has come in some funding around doctorates. Before that, all the masters and the doctorate students that have gone through the programs have self-funded, which, you know, in itself may also bring a certain relation to the profession, a certain passion maybe, but potentially also, you know, exclude some status diversity. With the funding coming in, although that's been advocated for a really long time, it does mean it currently excludes non-EU folk because of the way they cannot be employed with the public health servers on the moment of graduation. They can be a little later, but that is causing a clash. Whereas historically, counselling psychology in here is very diverse. It has a good handful of people who are non-EU each year joining in, and therefore creating actually a lovely diversity. Some other developments that are happening very presently and that are not finalized is that there's also a legal regulatory body coming in to regulate the field of psychology in Ireland. It's called CORU here. It's been regulating some other health professions. It is going to regulate psychology most likely as of late next year. It is currently proposing to regulate counselling, clinical and educational psychology separately, and then the title of psychology separately as well. So details are still being fine-tuned. I know these things are very different around the globe, how this is regulated or not. In terms of the last point that I'll touch on is something you mentioned, Michael, is health insurance. Health insurance here is very okay with reimbursing counselling psychologists because of the psychology body here in Ireland has very much advocated to individual health insurances to understand the equality between clinical and counselling. And therefore, most of the folk get reimbursements depending on their internal status of the psychology community. Hope that makes sense. Happy to take any questions later, but that's a little bit on Ireland.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Mike, would you like to go next?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Yetunde. Greetings, everyone, from darkest Africa. And I really mean that in the literal sense. It is very dark here right now. It is 9:30 in the evening, but at least it's not as bad as for Michael in Australia. We're contemplating going to bed still sometime. Perhaps I can give you an overview of what is in South Africa before I get into the challenges. Currently, psychology was first registered as a profession in South Africa in 1974 with the development of the Health Professions Act in South Africa, which regulated doctors, dentists, and psychologists. And the original registration was only clinical psychologists, but through the 1980s, counseling psychology programs developed, and we now have registration categories. We have a professional board for psychology, which resorts under our regulatory body, the Health Professions Council of South Africa. They regulate everyone from doctors to dentists to psychologists to occupational therapists, physiotherapists, speech therapists, dietitians, paramedics. Anyone involved in the health sector has to register with the Health Professions Council. And so we currently have clinical, counseling, educational, industrial, organizational, and research psychology as registered professions. To register as a psychologist in South Africa, one is required to obtain a master's degree, which is a 2-year program because there's 1 year master's academic, the M1 year, followed by a 1-year supervised internship in an applied setting. The acts of psychologists referred to as psychological acts are also regulated in South Africa. So there are limitations on what people can do. So there's a whole government gazette, there's a law prescribing what acts are reserved for psychologists. So the general public or lay counselors or quacks and charlatans, in theory, and I must point out just in theory, should not be doing. The practice is there are a lot of quacks and charlatans out there misleading the public and putting themselves out there as psychological counselors or therapists or whatever, and they mislead the public and break the law. But our professional board, the regulatory body, seems to be very reluctant to act or do anything about that and protect the profession. However, notwithstanding that, we do have this statutory protection, which we're supposed to enjoy. And so we have to kind of get to the master's degree level before we can actually register after the writing of a national board exam. So our board sets a national exam every year, and everyone who's passed their master's and internship must first write the board exam, and then they're entitled to register as a psychologist. We're quite fortunate at the moment. We have in the region of about 10,000 psychologists in South Africa, of whom about 2,000 and a bit are counseling psychologists. The largest category is clinical. It is kind of the category registration that is most recognized by the government. And as a result of that, 95% plus of counseling psychologists are in private practice. So we run our own businesses, we run our own practice on either a cash basis, or we claim from medical insurances, which is a challenge I'll come to just now. And that's purely because there are no government posts for counseling psychologists, or very few counseling posts. The only places in government where counseling psychologists are employed is the South African Military Medical Services, in other words, the Army Medical Corps, and in the prison services, the correctional services. The Department of Health, by and large, exclusively only employs clinical psychologists. We have been advocating and lobbying in that regard, and we're starting to see some headway that we are now starting to see posts for psychologists advertised in the State Health Service, requiring applications from clinical and or counseling psychologists. So we are making some headway there, but it's not a lot of headway. So by and large, most of us, including myself, are in private practice. On the professional front, we have formed Counselling Psychology South Africa. We've just passed our 5th birthday. We've been in existence for 5 years, and we were formed exclusively to lobby and advocate for counseling psychologists, because clinical psychologists were very well organized and lobbied for their category of registration. And from 2008, we were by and large being left behind. Medical insurers were refusing to compensate counseling psychologists. They said, we're not real psychologists. We don't deal with mentally ill people. We just deal with the worried well. And without saying that they're limiting psychological services, that was the net effect of what they were trying to do by marginalizing counseling psychologists and not reimbursing counseling psychologists. They were saving a bucket load of money. As an association, we've been making some headway in overcoming that. We've developed a very close working relationship with our clinical psychology colleagues. We have also forged a good relationship with the South African Society of Psychiatrists, and they've been instrumental in developing treatment protocols for something that is known in South Africa as prescribed minimum benefits. There are certain conditions that medical insurers have to cover by law. No matter what plan the person is on, or whether they have funds available, it must be covered by law. And those treatment protocols that are being published are now providing for clinical and counseling psychologists in the treatment of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, eating disorders, substance abuse disorders. And so we are achieving some recognition. So we are, as an association, making headway. We are faced with a lot of challenges. The counseling and clinical psychology programs were previously run in parallel with each other at South African universities. So the clinical and counseling psychologists attended the same lectures in the same lecture room, shoulder to shoulder, and it was only at the level of the internship where they diverged. The clinical psychologists would do their internship in a psychiatric hospital, and counseling psychologists would be channeled off to community settings, to public sort of clinics, educational settings, student guidance bureaus, and the like, which is consistent with what counseling psychology does. We don't see ourselves as being reductionist in only working within the medical model with psychopathology. We do take a broader position. We welcome what's in the position paper because I think it very accurately reflects what we believe counseling psychology to be. The challenges, local universities are now being forced to split the counseling and clinical psychology education programs by our regulatory body, who say that they must be entirely separate programs because there's no overlap in what we do. And as a result, some universities are shutting down their counseling programs. They reckon they don't have the funding. It's not viable to run separate clinical and counseling programs, so they're only focusing on their clinical programs. So local universities here in the Western Cape, where I practice, have all closed down their counseling psychology programs. But we are still in the privileged position where we still have 7 South African universities offering counseling psychology programs. So there are still 7 institutions churning out counseling psychologists, although there's a deficit in the Western Cape. At the recent board exams where I invigilate, at the July exam, there was 58 people writing the exam in the room. Only one of them was writing the counselling psychology exam. So, yeah, there are those challenges. We are marginalized by the funders. Our Health Professions Council and the Professional Board for Psychology don't stand up for us. They don't challenge the insurers. That's why we as an association have formed to lobby for our own profession. The numbers of counselling psychologists being turned out by the universities has shrunk. But as I say, we still have 7 institutions, each turning out approximately 5 to 8 counselling psychologists a year. Leading to their registration as counselling psychologists. So in that way, we're not that badly off. There are new moves afoot for the recognition of counselling psychologists with the government. So we're hoping to make some headway in that regard soon. And the position paper is going to be great for us in that we're going to be able to table that as a motivation for what counselling psychology should be in South Africa, that we don't only see the worried well. We are not just counsellors. And so, yeah, the position paper is going to be very helpful for us in the next 24 to 36 months going forward to lobby for better recognition of counselling psychologists. So that's pretty much where we are at in South Africa at the moment.
Thank you, Mike. Sue, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm just going to share my screen because I need a bit of a prop. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. So I've got some slides to go with what I'm talking about because I do need my bit of a prop. I'll talk a little bit about counselling psychology in the UK. So in the UK, since around 2009, all practitioner psychologists have been regulated by the Health and Care Professions Council. Previously to that, we were regulated by the BPS. As well as practitioner psychologists, there are a whole range of other health professionals who are regulated by the HCPC, including dietitians, paramedics, art therapists, so a wide range of health practitioners regulated by the HCPC. Currently, there are around 28,000 practitioner psychologists registered with the Health and Care Professions Council. All practitioner psychologists must be registered with the Health and Care Professions Council. It is illegal to practice as a practitioner psychologist, of which there are 7 domains, including clinical, counselling, education, sports and exercise, occupational, forensic, and health. So we cannot use those protected titles at all or carry out work as though under those protected titles unless you are registered with the Health and Care Professions Council. We're not quite as far as South Africa as yet, so the actual activities themselves that we undertake aren't regulated. And the title psychologist is not regulated at all. There was quite a huge grassroots movement to get the regulation of the title psychologist, because similarly we have people using a wide variety of titles and practicing. And I think the majority of us who have gone through the process of becoming qualified, adhering to those ethical standards, feel that the public are under risk of harm but by non-regulated professionals. Of those 28,000 practitioner psychologists, around 3,300 are counselling psychologists registered with the Health and Care Professions Council. So that's slightly less than educational psychologists. There are around 4,000 educational psychologists, so we're the 3rd largest domain of practitioner psychologists in the UK. We're quite a diverse bunch. So this is the HCPC data on us. We're more diverse than the other domains. Maybe one other is slightly more diverse than us in some areas, but we're particularly diverse on the ethnicity of the people who work in our profession. Still suffer a little bit on sex, which is something that I'm quite not concerned about, but I think it's something we need to balance up on. I don't think we have enough men in our profession, but certainly we're quite a diverse profession. As far as the Division of Counselling Psychology, so the Division of Counselling Psychology sits under the British Psychological Society. We have around 4,000 members. Not all of those are qualified and members who are regulated with the HCPC. Around 18% of our membership is trainees, people in training. So you can see there at any one time there are 644 there members in training. It is a requirement on most of the training courses in the UK that trainees are registered with the Division of Counselling Psychology. So that's a reasonably accurate figure of the number at any time of trainees going through the profession. So that would equate to around possibly 180, 200 trainees a year. There's been a steady increase in the number of counselling psychologists, members of the division, sort of levelling out a little bit now at around the 4,000 mark. And we have about 10% of our members come from overseas. So where do we work? As other countries have said, we do work in private practice and charities and not-for-profits, but increasingly a lot of our members are working in the NHS, either solely in the NHS, which is our public sector, or partially in the NHS and partially in private practice, or partially in academia or other areas. But we do work across the full range of services within the public sector, from mild, moderate to severe mental health and quite complex presentations. We work in physical health services, primary care services. We work in community-based services and secure settings. Some of our colleagues work in forensic services, like working in prisons. We have some who work in the education sector, often with children and young people with additional needs. And we have colleagues who work in social care as well. So we work right away across that. But we don't really have a good grasp of where our members are working. And there are some issues with the way that the data is recorded. So in our public sector in England alone, a lot of our colleagues are recorded on the employment records as another profession. So we're often recorded as a clinical psychologist or recorded as a psychotherapist, a CBT therapist. So the NHS itself doesn't have good data on how many counselling psychologists are working for it. So they published a census nearly a year ago now, in which they suggested there were 286 counselling psychologists working in the NHS. They had to correct this to 324. But we are, should we say, quite suspicious of these figures. We know from the colleagues that we have, and we know from our membership, that we feel that there are a lot more members working in the NHS than are recorded as working in the NHS. So that brings its own difficulties when they're looking to expand the workforce or commissioning services, that they haven't got accurate data. We're hoping, we have just completed our 2024 member survey, so we're hoping we will get a little bit better data from that and be able to extrapolate some information from that. In terms of employment, the opportunities we have excellent competencies. Our members are commended, particularly on their therapeutic skills and relational skills. And if they can get their foot into the NHS, we're told they sort of hit the ground running because of those therapeutic skills. We have to do 450 hours of supervised practice as part of our training here in the UK. And we're extremely creative, adaptable and flexible. There is an increase and a planned increase in the workforce, particularly in public sector mental health at the moment. So there's plenty of opportunities there. And there's a growth in the awareness of mental health and the role of psychology in well-being. So there are opportunities outside those traditional employment sectors as well. The challenges for us are the increase in new roles within the public sector in very narrow specific areas, sort of associated with, and they've got associated training pathways and curricula and funding that attracted to those trainings as well. So that sort of puts a challenge on the availability of possible posts for counselling psychology, or looking for, should we say, cheaper, easier routes to provide specific types of therapy, which sort of takes away from the demand possibly for counselling psychology. We have problems with having seats at the table. We're often not visible particularly in public sector. So when there are policy discussions and issues around commissioning and service development, we're often not there. So it's a big push for us to get our colleagues, particularly our senior colleagues, and we do have senior colleagues in very significant leadership roles and strategic development roles, who still don't seem to be at those discussions and having the input into policy development. And we still do have some issues with recruitment practices, nowhere near as bad as what I've heard from colleagues overseas today. The BPS has done a lot of work. And as our training and our competencies become more aligned, not totally aligned, but more aligned with that of clinical psychology, there is a big push now for advertising of roles which are based on competencies and not on adjectival title. So we are seeing an increase in opportunities being advertised for practitioner psychologists, applied psychologists, clinical or counselling psychologists. But there are still pockets where we do need to challenge that, where we often see roles just advertised for clinical psychology when that work can easily be done or readily be done by counselling psychologists as well. In terms of training, all the training in the UK is at doctoral level. That is either a 3-year full-time course or 4, 5, 6-year part-time courses in which we have academic content, skills training, training in 2 therapeutic modalities, as well as our 450 hours supervised practice and a significant research element to that work as well. We currently have 11 university-based doctoral programs and a BPS independent qualification. All of the training is currently accredited by the BPS as well as approved by the HCPC. This means if you study in the UK and you complete the qualification on the doctoral training program or by the BPS, you are automatically eligible for registration by the regulatory body. The standards in education and training are regularly reviewed and updated. However, there are challenges to the doctoral training programs, and we've had 4 recent closures of training programs in the UK.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We've run out of time. Do you mind if we leave the challenges and opportunities to the panel discussion? Would that be okay?
That's absolutely fine. I do go on a bit, Yetunde, that's fine.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to cut you.
No, that's fine.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Boja, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Bongju Huang. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm based in California. I'm representing counseling psychology in the US. I will talk briefly about our current status of counseling psychology in this country. 3 areas. One is about our counseling psychology division efforts. And second one is about education related, a couple of points about that. The third one is about as a profession. So as a division, I mean, we are a pretty large division. I think within American Psychological Association, there are about, I didn't count exactly, about 60 divisions. We are one of the largest divisions, I believe, pretty active. So our division is Division 17. And the efforts we've been making, at least the last several years, particularly last a few years, have been really focusing on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. So all the presidents last 3 years of presidency, every president has a 1-year active presidency, and they focused on really uprooting anti-Black racism within the division, within psychology. So they've been working hard. And newly elected new president for this year, 2024-25, she will continue. Actually, her focus is going to be similar, but her theme is going to be advancing a critical counseling psychology. I think her particular interest in social justice continues to also socioeconomic issues. So that's about our division efforts lately. In terms of education, like the UK and some other countries, psychologist is like a legal term, it's a protected term within the US. And you need to have a doctoral degree and you need to have a license to be called actually psychologist. So, but within actually our division and also as a APA, a large, and there have been some efforts to establish mass level counseling psychology programs. So meeting, and I believe there is a proposal how we can do that, and there's a proposal about accrediting master level counseling and psychology. We'll see what happens. So I think the key issue here is that how we can actually differentiate because all this counseling psychology program here in the USA doctoral level, how we can differentiate this master level counseling psychology program from doctoral level counseling psychology. In terms of educational curriculum, professional competencies, and scope of practice, right? So that will be challenging, and we will continue to navigate that. And actually, counseling psychology program in the US is very popular, very popular among students. I heard this is I don't think there is a real exact data out there, but some programs are like acceptance rate is as low as 1% or lower. So that's very, very popular program. There are 83 counseling psychology doctoral programs accredited by APA as of December last year. So they will update, I think, every year. And most of these programs are traditional PhD program because you need to do rigorous research as well as a practice. You need to learn both. So that's a PhD program. And only 12 of them are PsyD. PsyD is a Doctor of Psychology program. They mostly focus on practice. And last point of education. So also several of counseling psychology program is part of a combined programs, combination of like a clinical, school, and other psychology programs. And about the profession as a counseling psychology, unfortunately, we are experiencing kind of similar. It's a little bit different. First, there are several counseling psychology programs. We have lost the last, I don't know, a decade or two. Several pretty popular counseling psychology programs we lost. Also, there we have gained a few. So the number probably stayed kind of slightly lower, but kind of consistent over the years. So the funding issue has been always a kind of issue for us as well. And last point of profession, licensure requirement is changing. Actually, there have been a discussion and proposals, and now in actually application process for exam to become a licensed psychologist. There was only one exam, national kind of exam, and of course, each state has their laws and ethics exam too, but that's called EPP, Exam for Practice of Professional Psychology. It used to be just one. Now there will be part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is about knowledge, about practice, and part 2 is the skills, how to deal with the specific situations and cases like that. So some states, a few states already adopted. So if you want to be a newly licensed psychologist, you need to take 2 exams in these states. But most of the states haven't adopted yet. But they are supposed to. They are supposed to. Starting from January 1, 2026, all of these state psychology boards actually need to enforce about these new changes about this exam. So they have to require 2 exams for the newly psychologist licensed psychologist requirements. So that's a few points about our status within the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Boja. Right on time. Thank you. Okay, so we've now come to that place where we are going to have a panel discussion. Some of the questions I have picked up from what has been shared by colleagues across the globe. I also wanted to just share apologies from our colleague in New Zealand and in Singapore that they couldn't be with us this evening. Okay, so one of the things I picked up whilst everyone was doing their presentation was around the number of training programs that we had. And it seems that in Australia, if I remember correctly, Michael, we've got 1. Ireland, we have 1. I think, I can't remember what you said, Mike. Did you say 7?
Yeah, that's quite correct. We've currently got 7. We lost
7
2, so we went from 9 down to 7.
In South Africa, and in the US, we've got 83. In UK, we've got 11. I guess I'm a little bit curious, and I wondered whether somebody would like to maybe speak on the variation in the training program, with counseling psychology still being in some parts of the world quite a popular program. I'm going to direct that to Bojo. Maybe you go first, if that's okay.
Sure. So like I said, as of now, counseling psychology programs are doctoral programs. If you want to be a psychologist, you need to obtain doctoral level of a counseling psychology degree and then go through a licensure exam. A licensure exam actually operated by each state. Each state has a governing body, psychology board, and they have their different rules and laws about how to become a psychologist within their state. In terms of education, like I said, PhD programs, the traditional, the curriculums, if it's APA accredited, there are, I believe there are some programs not APA accredited still, maybe, but not many. So APA accredited, APA counseling psychology program, there are core competency areas that you need to actually, each program has to provide classes, courses, and to meet that requirement. For example, counseling theory and the practice and research and human biology-based kind of issues, all those kind of areas, right? So usually doctoral program, PhD program, you finish your coursework within 3 to 4 years. And then after that, you need to do 1 full year internship. So you do that full-time internship for 1 full year. And then, of course, you need to finish your dissertation. Usually, it takes 5 to 7 years to finish doctoral program. And I think there was a data about, I think the average was actually close to 7 years before. Maybe it's shorter than now. So for me, I took quite a lot of years. I couldn't finish my dissertation and quickly. So for me, I started working full-time before I finished my dissertation, and then I got my license after that. So, and like I said, there is a PsyD program. I know there is someone here with a PsyD degrees, and there are not many PsyD programs for counseling psychology. A lot of PsyD programs actually clinical psychology programs within the US. There are a lot of professional psychology institutions, and they accept a lot of students to train as a clinical psychology within their PsyD program. That's also a little bit of the differences here.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to come in here?
There is only one course here. So in terms of diversity in Ireland, there's just one.
I guess the question was around, why do we have so much variation? Why do we have 1 somewhere, 11 somewhere else, 7 somewhere else? When we think about our clinical psychology colleagues, there's so many programs available in different countries for that training.
Yeah. I mean, I personally don't know the history of what happened to the other degree that was there. I know it closed a good few years ago, but I wouldn't know the story behind that. I think the funding in Ireland has been a really long, outstanding issue, the lack of funding for counselling psychology. And I can well imagine that played a major role, and that trickled into the funding. So the current funding is given in part by the Public Health Service, but also by one private organization who is funding some individual students. And then in order to work in the Public Health Service, the students need to practice in the health service to then work in it later. Otherwise, they're not allowed. And that has been a really, really long time issue to make sure that everyone gets enough hours in the health service so that they qualify to work in the public sector upon graduation. So that's just a wild guess based on this question. I can well imagine that's been a real challenge to get the counselling psychology students, even though they're 14 a year over 3 years, to get all of them allocated for the 3 years to make sure they have enough qualification in the health service to then work in the health service. Who is the biggest sponsor of the trainee programs? That then maybe other programs didn't seem viable. And maybe, you know, as an expat myself in Ireland, I think there's such a population within Dublin, which is where the training program is held, which is maybe quite contrasted to some of the other cities. So that may also play a role, the population.
Does any Michael, Sue, or Mike, does anybody want to come in on this?
Yeah, perhaps I can just add on to what Tim was saying there. In South Africa, the difference or the differential between clinical training and counselling training boils down to money. The university is now being forced to split the clinical and counselling training. Meant that they felt they didn't have the financial reserves to be able to run two separate parallel programs, and they had to sacrifice one. So which one are they going to sacrifice? The clinical psychology programs are funded. The clinical psychology master students are almost assured of a scholarship or a bursary from the National Department of Health. They will get a funded or paid internship for the one-year internship, and they're almost assured of a post in the state healthcare service after they graduate. Counselling psychologists, on the other hand, pay for their own studies. They have to pay for their own degree at master's level. They have to do an unfunded internship. In other words, they go a year without any income while they're doing their internship. And in many cases, they have to even actually pay for their own supervision. So their supervisor who's going to supervise their casework and guide them and mentor them, they have to pay for that out of their own pocket. And so universities look at that and say, well, listen, this counselling psychology things an exercise in futility. And that's why locally the University of Stellenbosch and the Western Cape University have terminated their counselling psychology programs, but continued with their clinical because there's money there. That's the crux of the matter. It's not for a lack of demand. There are more people than the universities can accommodate who would love to do a counselling psychology master's, but there's just not the program and the funding for it. So there's a financial crunch.
Thank you. I think what seems to be emerging from the discussion, and Michael just mentioned that, and we actually got some views in the chat around the lack of funding in the UK, for example, and also the dominance of the National Health Service. The other consideration is around the population size and whether perhaps that goes some way to explaining the differences. I'm a little bit curious, and it'll be great to hear from colleagues as to what you think about a global training program for counselling psychology. Any thoughts? Ashutosh, do you want to go first? Sue, I'm going to come to you.
I would agree to this population theory, because in India, we are 150 crore people, and it's a huge number. And that is the reason every year we are having new courses in counseling. Mostly these are postgraduate diplomas and master programs. Every new university which is starting, they are starting a psychology department with applied psychology programs and with a specialization in counseling. So most of the applied psychology programs have either clinical or counseling psychology as specializations. And all these diploma programs are counseling and therapy diploma programs. So because we are a huge number in population, so we have similarly huge burden of psychological support that is needed by the people. So demand is high. That is why the courses are coming up. But the recent developments with new education policy has created a bit of mess that maybe clinical psychology programs are more likely to be opened unless there is, we are fighting that issue locally. Because in new education policy, the regulator has introduced a graduation program in clinical psychology. Otherwise, there was no specialization in graduation level. So once they have graduation in clinical psychology and that is regulated, and they intend to call it counseling psychologist after completing graduation in clinical psychology. So this is a crisis situation that we are fighting at present. But definitely population and demand is one thing. Then how policies are made, how lobbying is done at the top level where funding is being allocated to these branches. So I believe this is a global scenario that clinical psychology, because they belong to the medical model and they are close to the medical fraternity, and all the health departments and the administration of the health department is controlled by the medical practitioners, be it psychiatrists or physicians, or so they are more aligned with these clinical psychology. That is why these fundings are going more towards clinical psychology. That is why that is what I believe. And that is my assumption. I think so.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Sue, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, and just building upon what Ashutosh said, I think that's really interesting. I think funding is a massive issue here in the UK too. Our clinical psychology trainees are actually employed by our public sector from the day they start their training. So they draw a salary, a significant salary, all the way through their training, and their training is funded for them, and the course is funded by the public sector, by the NHS. Whereas our trainees in counselling psychology have to fund themselves. There are significant restrictions on how the courses are run, put there by the BPS, based on student-staff ratios, which impact on the financial sustainability of the courses. And the challenges for our doctoral programmes are the funding issues on running the courses, but also attracting staff at the salary that they're able to offer to work on those programmes. Yet, there is significant oversubscription onto our counselling psychology courses. They're significantly in demand. All the places are filled easily. Yet we know that there are good candidates who want to train as counselling psychologists who are unable to train because of the funding issue, because they have to self-fund. I think over here, what I think we've noticed is I would say clinical psychology is moving away from the medical model. Although they work in the public sector, they work in health, they are moving more away from the medical model. And in some senses, a lot of those, although our philosophies aren't similar, they are getting nearer in some senses. So they are taking some of the best bits of counselling psychology, if you like, in being aware of relational impacts and working with the self, and possibly the need for their own therapeutic process going through their training. So for some programs and for some clinical psychologists, they seem to be drawing the best bits away from counselling psychology as well as they train. And certainly some of the models being used in the NHS are starting to draw on that, yet there is still very much a reductionist view in some areas where we're looking at very synthesizing it down to a diagnosis and a disorder, rather than seeing people as people and working with people as we tend to work with people as counselling psychologists, I think. I have to say that the majority of our trainees now, I think there's very few who don't get some practice, supervised practice in the NHS during their training. Nearly everybody gets some supervised practice in the NHS during their training. There's no requirement to have training in the NHS before being appointed in the NHS, though it does help to have had some experience in the NHS. So the majority of our trainees have at least one of their clinical training placements within the NHS while they're doing their training. So I think in some senses we're in a fortunate position, but there's still a big battle for us to ensure that our training courses are sustainable. Lots of challenges for us. Again, our trainees who do work in the NHS, most of them do it on a non-paid basis alongside their clinical psychology colleagues who are being paid a good salary. And we have small pockets of good practice coming where we are getting our trainees paid in the NHS for their training. So that's starting to take off, but still a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Sue. Michael, do you want to come in before we take questions and answers?
Yeah, just want to add, it's very similar in Australia. I think the training difficulties that we face here are really a product of a range of factors. At postgraduate level, universities aren't funded well by the government, so most postgraduate programs actually lose money. Where universities make money is with undergraduates, where you can have hundreds of students in programs, and as a result of the postgraduate level, because of accreditation requirements, you need to have very small staff-student ratio. So what that means, it becomes really costly. And for universities, they see those programs as being unaffordable, and they've sort of left in a position the last 20 years here in Australia where, aside from clinical psychology, all other areas have lost programs. So as I said earlier, we've gone down from 7 to 1 program, and that hasn't been due to lack of interest. All of our programs had hundreds of applications each year for often 15 or 20 places, but it's more about the funding arrangements and universities having to make decisions about if we're going to only offer 1 or 2 programs, what's the most attractive, and it ends up being clinical psychology programs because of how our systems are, how our sort of health system and our private practices tend to be funded.
Thank you. It's time for us to just open up the conversation to include everyone that's here today. I had a question. I hope it's okay for me to go first. I'm a little bit curious as to whether anyone can answer this. Do we have a identity crisis as counselling psychologists? Is that a challenge? Don't be afraid to answer.
Don't need to jump in. I do feel we do a lot of navel gazing, Yetunde. We look at ourselves and we do find it difficult to explain who we are and what we do. And I think something came out of our conference this year, which was really helpful for me. Maybe we don't need to explain it. Maybe we just need to show what we do and be more vocal and showing what we do. And maybe then people will get the message. I think maybe, I do think we do tie ourselves in knots trying to explain what counselling psychologists are and what we do and how that is different or how it is the same as another domain of counselling psychology. And maybe we over worry about that a little bit. I don't know. I'm
hoping that the position paper helps to make that a little bit clearer. I remember, and some of you might remember this conversation we had very earlier on when we established the Global Counselling Psychology Forum, and the way that we somehow explained it was that we embody counselling psychology. We don't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I'm going to go to work now and become a counselling psychologist." As a counselling psychologist, that is who we are. And maybe that's one of the difficulties in explaining what we do, because we are an embodiment. John.
Yeah, Yetunde, I agree. John Broderick, I was the first chair of the Counselling Psychology Division in Ireland back in 1997, and it's been a long, long battle. I think it's clinical psychology that has the identity crisis these days, because, as I put in my chat, a lot of clinical psychologists I know are going outside of psychology to train as psychotherapists, because that's where the meaning is, not in the medical model. But I think the real issue, as somebody mentioned it earlier, it's about people who are in positions of power, and even some senior some senior counselling psychologists, you said, Sue, in the UK, who are very senior, still don't have a seat at the table. So I think it's political, and we should be going out doing Counselling Psychology Lives Matter or something like that, because there's definitely a political issue here.
Thank you, John. Anyone else? Any questions?
Yetunde, I can add my comment about your question about whether our identity is in crisis. I don't think are in a crisis, but our identity always evolving. At least in the US, and we have counseling psychology. It's rooted in the sort of student guidance counseling and career counseling, that area, and then we have evolved over the years, right? And then also medical model, unfortunately, sort of dominant force in the health field, and have been influencing a lot of this psychology license laws and all those kind of things. So we are still influenced. So medical field has a lot of money, and money speaks a lot volume. We talked about the funding issues. So I guess we've been sort of trying to deal with that. And also we don't stay there. I think we continue to evolve, and our counseling psychology training model has been always like a science practitioner kind of combination of somewhere. But also we've been adding the advocacy a lot last several years. So we continue to evolve in terms of focus and identity.
Thank you. Can I ask
one?
Sorry,
to add to the same discussion, when one potential challenge that has been strongly flagged here is because there's only one doctoral program and because it's only gotten some funding since last September, not all 14 students are funded, which creates huge discrepancy within the cohort. 10 of them are publicly funded, 2 of them are privately funded. For example, the privately funded students have worked 2 days a week in the private practice. This is where they get paid, and then also work 2 days a week in the public health service where they're unpaid. And like all the generations of counselling psychology, including myself before them, they are joining clinical psychologists who are paid. So one challenge that was very much raised is how the course in counselling psychology now, over the past 12 months, had to adapt their approach and their agenda to suit the 4-day working week of the public health service, and because they're now employed, right? The funding is in part distributed because they are employed, and part of the intake process into the doctorate is by the professors and the public health service now, right? Whereas before it was solely the doctoral training. And you know, I won't bore you with all the nuances, but the training for many years would have included, you know, the philosophical and supervision side of things, the research side of things, and then 2 days a week practice on different places. That 2 days a week has now transformed into 4 days a week. So hence, you know, the course has had to adapt. So one challenge that was very much raised is in like, is the course going to conform and become an HSC machine or a public health service machine to deliver graduates and potentially lose the counselling psychology qualities that it has. Don't think it has so far, but it's certainly a question worth raising, and that was put back to the doctorate this year as well to make sure it maintains its counselling psychology identity and continues striving for equity in funding and workplace availability for the graduates and improve their quality of life. So I think that's just to chip into the debate of identity crisis. I mean, I can see that very locally happening as well, and sort of eyebrows being raised and wondering, are we losing our identity or not? And something to be watched, a space to be watched.
If I can speak for India, I would say that as many of you have said, that it is an evolving process, and we have evolved. I can see in last 5, 7, 8 years, the identity crisis has definitely gone down. I would not say it has come to zero, but it has definitely gone down. People are identifying themselves. People are asserting themselves. See, this is who we are. This is what we do. This is how we are different from other practitioners, be it clinical psychologists or psychiatrists for that matter, or non-counseling or non-psychologists, general psychotherapists. So this is how people have started creating their own unique spaces in the public domain. And the job vacancies which have started coming in past few years, they specifically ask for counseling psychologists now. It was not there a couple of years ago. So I would say it was there. Definitely we have gone through that, but now things have changed a lot. And I would say that it's a continuously evolving process, and we have to have a long way to go.
Mike, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, Yetunde, I have them all the time. But basically, I can only agree with what John was saying there. I don't think it's us that has the identity crisis. It's the clinical psychologists. In South Africa, the majority of clinical psychologists in private practice tend to espouse the philosophical underpinnings of counselling psychology. They just don't want to be called counselling psychologists because of the discrimination in funding, access to employment and the like. But what they do, as Sue was saying, is actually sort of moving closer and closer to what we do in counselling psychology. So I think to come back to something you asked earlier, is there kind of a a need for a global approach to training of counselling psychologists? And I would agree, yes, because here in South Africa, our Health Professions Council recently tabled a proposal last year that is seeking to dumb the profession down, and they want to make psychologist training a 4-year bachelor's degree. And clinical and counselling psychology will then become specializations. And the counselling psychologists who currently practice will then sort of have a grandfather clause and become specialists. But that's going to almost probably mean the death of counselling psychology, because the insurers, the health services, they're all going to employ these, as we call them jokingly in South Africa, barefoot psychologists, because they'll be cheaper. They'll work for less money. Their training will be cheaper. They'll churn them out by the thousands, which is not going to bode well for counselling psychology. And we don't believe they can do the work of a counselling psychologist. If you cannot pack into 4 years the amount of training necessary to train a counselling psychologist. And we feel that the Global Counselling Psychology Position Paper will be something we can use to argue against that motivation, to say, look, here's what counselling psychology is about, here's what we do, and you can't do it in 4 years. So yeah, moving towards a sort of a global consolidation. There's always going to be differences around the world for various reasons, political, socioeconomic. Some countries will go with the doctoral programs. I don't think that's affordable in South Africa. They're saying it takes too long to train psychologists, so to advocate for a 7-year doctoral program is probably not going to work in South Africa. And that's tied into the political system and the moves towards trying to implement a national health insurance system similar to the NHS here in South Africa. Well, I think we're many years away from it. Still, it's a very political fraught process. But yeah, a kind of a global position on training, what counselling psychologists are, could be very useful for us in terms of the lobbying work we do, advocating for our profession. And that gives us more ammunition to say, look, it's not just our opinion. We're not arguing from a position of self-interest. This is what's going on around the world. And so, yeah, that's why we like the position paper. We've yet to sort of disseminate it widely in South Africa. We will do so after tonight. And yeah, we embrace it, and we're hopefully going to use that for our benefit and for our patients' benefit.
Thank you, Mike. Michael, did you want to say something?
Yeah, look, just coming back to your original question around do we have an identity crisis, I think internally we don't. I think if I speak about Australia here, I think we have more of a challenge externally about other psychologists and other mental health professionals not knowing who we are or not understanding what we do. I can't say the amount of conversations I've had over the years when people have tried to become a counselling psychologist prior to national registration, where it's become a protected title, who would often say to me, why can't I become a counselling psychologist? I do counselling in my job. You know, I think sometimes a name can create challenges at the idea that those externally think that if anyone who does counselling, aren't they just a counselling psychologist? So I do think that there's a bit of a piece of work around really sort of explaining outward, outside of the profession internally, that who we are, what we do, what our competencies are. And I think the position paper is a really fantastic starting point for that from a global perspective.
So we've had a comment from Holly in the chat, which I really like. I wondered whether I could invite Holly to speak to this. Is that okay?
I think, gosh, trying to formulate my thoughts. I was really excited to see the opportunity to come together as a global community. And of course, counselling psychology has its roots within Western psychology and, you know, sort of the Rogerian tradition, which is, you know, intrinsically white and Western in its perspective. And yet, as a global community, it feels as though there's potentially a really exciting opportunity to expand our lens beyond that. And it feels really important in the context of decolonization and, you know, sort of our overarching social justice mission, if you like.
Thank you. I think if it's okay, I'm gonna go first, and then I'm going to invite colleagues to please comment. I think we were very, very mindful actually of your point around moving away from a westernized position, because we do recognize that actually in different parts of the world, the beauty of counselling psychology is the invitation to go back to the both the spiritual the traditional way of healing. And so the beauty of counseling psychologists is that we utilize those traditions in working with the people that we serve. So in the position paper, actually, just a little story behind that. Originally, we called it the white paper. And because of the discussions that we have at one of the conferences that we had, and the panel were all present there, we realized that calling it the white paper actually minimized the position that we were trying to take, and fell into that, you know, the point that you're making here around taking a Western Eurocentric and you know, position, and that's why we changed the name. And what you will find in the position paper is that within each locality, you will find the emerged traditions within each locality and how they utilize it in their practice. So thank you so much for raising that point. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I very much applaud what you just brought in, Holly. I think it's a really great point, and we certainly need to keep in mind. And you know, when the position paper even evolves, maybe we can look at this even further and see what more we can include. Personally, I was very, very pleased to have a good chunk on social justice, which I find sometimes is left out when we talk about it. And is also at the time of when we were talking about this was something I was challenging in my supervisions and with some colleagues, as in like, no, but in my understanding, this is a fundamental part of counseling psychology. So, you know, actually meeting my lovely colleagues here on the panel and being able to talk about that was really, really great. So yeah, in terms of the social justice piece, that is there. I'd be totally on board for expanding and elaborating on that, and for counseling psychology to do even more in that. I really think we have such a beautiful profession and philosophy, and we don't maybe always show up to the political spaces where we could do social justice. And I would love to see more counseling psychologists in those spaces, media and political spaces and activism, all of it.
Thanks, team. I think one thing perhaps to add, the position paper is a starting point, and it's central to the idea that we can have a unified voice globally for counseling psychology. However, it doesn't take away, I think, what we are mindful of. Certainly, I hope I speak on behalf of other colleagues in the forum, is that although, well, I am based in the UK, the way that I practice in the UK will be very different. For example, if I went back to, you know, my roots in West Africa, right? I might be able to take the knowledge, but the practice of the knowledge will be very different. And so we're very mindful that we're not forcing views of the different localities on one another. I think that is something that we're very mindful of. That notwithstanding, as I said, the position paper is about establishing that unifying voice, being able to raise the visibility of counseling psychology, ensuring that, you know, the box that, you know, applied psychology may have put us in as the you know, the up and coming sister or brother, however that we're regarded, you know, in some localities we're regarded as counselors, that actually we're providing support, we're working on research, we're collaborating on research, we're ensuring that, you know, our practice is best practice, that we're improving and enhancing the standards of our training, and as part of the discussions that we've had here today, you know, the idea that we could potentially have a global training program for counseling psychology. So I just wanted to make a little bit of a separation between what the position paper stands for, and as part of that, included within the Global Counselling Psychology Forum is an establishment of that unified voice and vision that we have for counseling psychology. No matter where you go in the four corners of the world, if I say I'm a counseling psychologist, the hope is that we are recognized as an applied psychology profession. Does anybody want to add anything to that? I'm mindful of time. Or any last questions, perhaps? We have a very quiet counselling psychology group tonight. Michael is very early. It's 5 o'clock now in Australia.
It's almost 6:30 in the morning. So
oh
yes.
wow, okay. So we're just gonna we're taking it down to the Counselling Psychology Club. So okay. Any last comments from our panel?
Well, we just look forward to doing this again next week, where we will obviously be attracting a group of participants from different time zones to what we're doing today. So, yeah, I'd just like to thank the people who have come out, yeah, especially our 2 participants from South Africa. So nice to see you guys. Maybe we'll see more, Carolyn and Janelle. Maybe next week being mid-morning here in South Africa, we might stimulate a bit more interest.
Yeah. Well, on my part and on behalf of the forum members and the panel that attended today, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As Mike says, we have another of the same next week, Wednesday, the 28th. It will be 10 a.m. British Summer Time, and please don't tell me to recall the time zones from the rest of the world. But I also wanted to say thank you to the contributors to the position paper. It was some time coming, but I think that, you know, we're very grateful to have at least started something. You know, the premise of having a Global Counselling Psychology voice is not just to have a small forum member. So if there's anybody here who is not currently represented and would like to get to speak to the chairs of their divisions or the presidents of their division to contact us, we'll be very happy to welcome them into the forum. And hopefully, maybe, who knows, I don't like to put a time on these things, we will have a joint conference in person soon, hopefully. That's the aim anyway. But yeah, thank you, everyone.